Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! In his 1986 novel, Plaha, translated into English as The Scaffold, Chingiz Aitmatov, Kyrgyzstan's great writer, tells the story of Avdiy Kalistratov, an idealistic young man who joins a group of drug smugglers traveling to a remote corner of Central Asia, to Kyrgyzstan, to be precise, where large swathes of cannabis grow wild in the picturesque Kizilkuh region. Aitmatov describes in vivid detail the brutal process of harvesting and trafficking the drug by a criminal group. But how close is this depiction to reality? This is a question I put to Gulzat Botoeva, Associate Professor of Criminology at Swansea University and an expert on illegal economies in Eurasia, including cannabis production in Kyrgyzstan. We discuss how the harvesting began, who benefits from it, and how local authorities respond to the phenomenon. Is there any incentive in Kyrgyzstan to legalize the crop? In my newsletter, you can find a list of Gulzat's publications on the topic. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hey Gulzat, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Hi Agnieszka, thank you so much for inviting me as well.
So let's start by explaining where does cannabis grow in Kyrgyzstan? Which are the areas where we can find it?
That's a really good question. In general, I think cannabis grows actually in a lot of places in Kyrgyzstan. You know, that Kyrgyzstan is actually 90% mountainous, so only 10% is actually used for, living and industrial kind of, purposes, for agricultural purposes, and the rest are the mountains. But I need to put a caveat in here is because although it does grow in a lot of different regions in Kyrgyzstan, the cannabis that is used as a drug and which has the high potency, it's actually grown mostly in Issyk region in the north of Issyk Lake. So specifically, Tup region where I did actually my research, that's where it has been specifically identified as a region where cannabis will have the high potency and obviously then people can get high.
So tell me, did cannabis have any meaning, spiritual or traditional or medical for people in Kyrgyzstan or not at all? Is it something that people knew for centuries or not really?
I mean, I had a look at this question myself when I did my research in Kyrgyzstan. And in a lot of cases, people were saying that it didn't actually have much spiritual meaning for Kyrgyz people. A lot of the people who actually started harvesting hashish, they started mainly in the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union and obviously the transformation of the economy and, people losing their jobs and the lands and other state assets have been actually privatized. And those years, specifically like mid-1990s, they were really, really harsh years for a lot of people. So they were saying that actually, yes, cannabis in the Tup region in Kyrgyzstan was actually well known during the Soviet times because there were actually some, underground groups who would actually come from Russia and make it during the summertime and then just basically transport it back, to Russia or other Soviet republics. But local people were actually not mainly involved in this harvesting in Soviet times. I have also tried to look at pre-Soviet use of hashish or cannabis among the local population, but there were not many resources. There were only some of the, maybe notes saying that local people have used it in the past. but it has been actually quite harshly criminalized even during the Russian Empire, when the Kyrgyzstan was joined or actually taken as part of the colonies. So it was considered as something like, that has to be harshly kind of, stopped, even before the Soviet Union started in the region.
So how did the cultivation of cannabis for illicit profit began? You mentioned that it was the 1990s. Was the purpose basically for self-use, or was it for drug trafficking, basically? And who were the groups who started the harvesting?
So the harvesting started. So it's actually not a cultivation. We need to kind of differentiate a bit. That's why I use the term harvesting, because most of the people who were actually collecting hashish, they were not cultivating it. It is wildly grown in the mountains in the Tup region. So they basically go to the, either to the land which is given to them for agricultural purposes. And in a lot of cases, it's like, for instance, the land was not cultivated, for other crops, like legal crops. Then that place would be actually quite good for the cannabis. It would grow wildly in there, or just, to any kind of field not far from the villages or a little bit further away. So one kind of, note to make in here that they're not cultivating it. They were not cultivating it, and they were mainly harvesting it, just collecting it. But mainly, so local people started making it in the 1990s. And in the 90s, it was basically everyone. It was even older people, middle-aged people, even children, because as they were saying, it was harsh period of time, very kind of harsh, because they lost their jobs. Now they had to be officially self-employed, according to the political kind of discourses. But it was a period where the transformation was really, really harsh. Start kind of cultivating their own land, etc. So it was just basically people kind of starting harvesting it. But it was mainly for the purposes of selling. So they wouldn't use it. Purpose wasn't for their own use. And it was actually frowned upon by a lot of people if they had kind of been using it. Obviously, there were some younger, men usually who would use it a little bit, but it wasn't the main purpose, obviously. Yeah, so a lot of them did it for money, so they would sell it, and then there would be a few people who would actually come, some of the dealers, usually from the capital city, Bishkek, and then they will just buy it in bulk and then collect it and take it to Bishkek. And then either it would be distributed in the capital city, or it will also go to Kazakhstan or Russia. So that's how it gets.
And what does the harvesting process look like? So what does one need in order to start harvesting? I don't need any advice to harvest it. I'm just curious what the process looks like and whether it's easy or if it's a complicated one.
Very good question. The harvesting in Issyk region, for hashish wasn't on a large scale. So that's why I also write about it as a small-scale harvesting, because it was completely different, for instance, from other parts of the world where cannabis and hashish, for instance, was made, where, for instance, in Morocco or in Afghanistan, it would be on an industrial scale. They would use the technology for pressing and other things. Whereas in Issyk, what I have kind of, explored was that people would just go and walk around and try to find the cannabis leaves, which were not kind of, collected. So mainly they will try to collect the upper leaves of the plant and rub it between their hands. And then the more you kind of, rub it and you collect more, you rub it again. And then there is this kind of, sticky kind of, substance emerges, which if you kind of, keep rubbing and, collecting more, then it just grows a little bit more and more and more. So, and then that would become basically a hashish, which would have, high potency.
I think it was in one of the Chingiz Aitmatov's novels. There was this scene where, naked people just walk around those cannabis plants and the juices stay on their bodies. So how realistic is this portrayal? How realistic is this scene?
I don't know. I mean, possibly. I mean, I was also kind of, hearing that sometimes from people who read Plaha by Aitmatov. But he was describing specifically the underground kind of, I think, groups coming to Kyrgyzstan from Russia. I mean, I don't remember he said it, but I think that was the image. No, in the 90s and later on, people never collected or harvested hashish by being naked. And again, the cannabis could be actually very short. I mean, what Aitmatov was actually describing, like, there's 2 meters of cannabis plants, like, and then someone just walking through it. Whereas I think in the fields, when you go there, it can be like literally half a meter long. They could be very short. So it's impossible to do it in that way. And I think that's more, I don't know, maybe it was a historical fact, or it was more kind of, artistic imagination, but it never happened like that in the 90s and throughout 2010s.
That's sad because it was a very, very beautiful scene and it would be a very romantic way of presenting Kyrgyzstan to the world. But literature obviously has its own rules. But tell me, so local people, as you said, usually don't smoke hashish, but is there any stigma surrounding it, or is there any social, let's say, stigma related to smoking, or is just something that people, in Kyrgyzstan don't do?
No, I think in Kyrgyzstan in general, smoking cannabis is widespread. Obviously, there is some stigma and people don't do it openly. It's not like people just walk around on the street and just smoke weed, as it can happen in London nowadays. But it is not as stigmatized, I guess, as, other drugs taking. So cannabis is more kind of, it's okay, right? Within the region where I did research, I think people actually didn't like the fact that someone would smoke it. So there was kind of this informal prohibition almost, informal rule that it is better not to smoke it. And there were lots of narratives actually about it that, we do it for work. But what I actually explored in my work, it wasn't just, stigmatization of addiction, but more like how people kind of cope with conducting illegal activity, which is considered as criminal by the state because, the police still was catching people and it was a criminal according to the law. But a lot of people kind of, being involved in this activity. So I looked at it from this kind of perspective. And then what I tried to kind of, theorize and analyze was that actually people try to legitimate this illegal activity by kind of, talking about it as their work. So it was, their work ethic, which was for them important. They were saying, we don't sit, just lazily. We don't wait for their work to come to us. We're actually looking, for work and we are looking after ourselves. So that was kind of, one of the important things. And the way how they were also talking about it, going to the field, it also meant that they were referring to, again, work-related, themes. And that they're not in that, either to the state or in that to microcrediting organizations, or they're not in that to their relatives or friends. That was also an important thing for them too. And on top of that, because Issyk region was the region where opium was produced during the Soviet times, which is completely different drug, obviously. but it was legal until mid-20th century. So it started being produced in the 1960s, even before the Soviet Union kind of, came during the Russian Empire. And Kyrgyzstan was producing around 88% of the opium, which was needed actually for the whole Soviet Union until the mid-20th century. So for a lot of people, it was also kind of a parallel, to the work that their grandparents probably were doing, up until 1960s. And then they were saying, okay, it was legal, during the Soviet times, maybe not the whole throughout, not whole Soviet kind of, new Union period, but until the 1960s, 70s. And they were working, they were producing opium for legal purposes. So they were making this kind of parallels between their hashish harvesting and opium production in the Soviet period time as well.
So what are the other narratives around cannabis? Because, say if in the 90s it became such an important part of people's lives in the Izekul region, were there any, stories that people were telling each other about cannabis, or maybe any urban legends? How was the drug scene in general and the plant?
I think what I am kind of, describing, it's not like, Latin America where you go I don't know, especially from the movies that you see, right, about Latin American drug production where everything is kind of, violent and etc. It's very quiet. I mean, and it's mundane, and you almost kind of think it's something that is work, right? I mean, you go to the field, collect some of the harvest this kind of, hashish heads, try to rub them. So it's nothing that would be extraordinary in that kind of sense, unless the police would come, obviously, and then try to catch them. And people would try to hide or run away or hide their hashish. So they would be also alert, obviously, if, the police were coming to the region and they were doing some raids, because it would mean either being arrested and taken to the police station or actually paying a bribe, which would be quite a lot in some cases, because I haven't added that as well, but a lot of people who actually were making hashish were the ones who were hit quite harshly by the socioeconomic transformations, and a lot of families which were struggling much more even by the end of 2010s, either because they lost their land, they didn't have much livestock, or even if they were considered as a kind of mid-level families, it wouldn't be still enough, for kind of living for a whole year, because agricultural sector, the way how it worked, by distributing the land to people and then basically saying this is now your plot and you have to kind of live off that and have the livestock. It doesn't actually create the profit for a whole year for a family. And obviously, that land was distributed only in the 1996. And then, more and more families emerge, they grow. And then that plot also becomes kind of, distributed among the family members. Now, the family doesn't have 3 hectares. It only has 0.8 hectares, right? And the whole family needs to live on that. So younger generation families, they were struggling quite a lot in the agricultural sector because there is no job. Either you have to go to the capital city or have to go to Russia or to other countries, mainly Russia at that time, or you have to try to live off your, plots in the village. So this kind of, economic inequalities which started emerging, emergence of some more wealthier families which were able either buy the land from their neighbors or relatives who couldn't afford to cultivate it at the time, started kind of, emerging. There were some mid-like kind of, level families which still struggled. Especially what I was also describing in my research is that actually you also need to understand how agricultural sector is very seasonal. They need to rely on the money that they would get mainly in autumn from cultivation of their legal crops or from the livestock, which usually comes from the pastures. And they wait, for the autumn for good harvest. And even that, because of the market economy, 1 year potatoes could cost quite a lot of money. The next year, everything just, can be thrown away because the money, is not worth it. So this kind of, price fluctuations, they can also hit the agricultural economy quite a lot. So all of this together, with also climate changes happening, harsh spring seasons, they can lead to bad harvest for the legal crops. And people especially in summer season, why hashish also has become quite important for the people living in that area is that, summer you're waiting still for your harvest of legal crops. And this is when you're completely, cashless. And that's how hashish becomes useful. So I also kind of, looked at how hashish has been used also as a kind of currency for paying for some kind of, small purchases in the shops, etc.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. So, tell me, what does the situation look like now when it comes to harvesting hashish and selling hashish? Has it changed anyhow since President Japarov came to power? Or, this change of power didn't influence the situation anyhow?
I'm not really sure because I haven't followed this topic, in the last few years. The last time I have been to the community or the communities where people were, harvesting hashish was just before the pandemic. So since then, I haven't actually been. So I'm not really sure what is happening exactly at the moment, but I'm sure that people still rely on hashish harvesting. It started changing even in late 2010s from before, because I actually started my research with my master's degree, so it then continued into my PhD later on. So I first went in the middle of 2000, before 2005, 2004, 2005. And then I continued 2009, 11, until the mid-2010s. But in my latest visits, people were saying that it's becoming much harsher, the control of the cannabis production in the region. And it started already, I think, throughout 2010s. So there were more raids, more police visits, and it led to the fact that less people were involved in harvesting hashish, and mainly males rather than, women and men and children, because men could actually travel on the horses and go slightly kind of, further away from the villages. So they could also run away a bit easier if the police arrived. So it meant that actually it become more, I wouldn't say professionalized, like they would just, become professionals, but it meant that not everyone were making hashish. The image that I was giving in the 1990s, how everyone was going to the fields, even when I went in the 2000s, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like, the elderly were involved. It wasn't that everyone were involved, but mainly the families which were struggling, obviously. And they needed a little bit more boost and support. Those families could rely on hashish harvesting a bit more.
And let's look back at how the state responded to the practice of cannabis harvesting from the Soviet times, let's say. Can we describe this, relationship more or less? Was it mostly like turning a blind eye, or was it really policing in the beginning?
hashish harvesting was really criminalized like drug addiction and drug production in general. If you talk about it more in general terms, it was actually quite criminalized during the Soviet times. And specifically, the fact that I was talking about how opium production has been stopped in the Soviet times was actually based on the state's narrative that more and more people actually becoming addictive to opium and therefore it needs to be stopped. And that was kind of decision which led to the fact that why then no opium has been produced in Kyrgyzstan. So on top of that, then, all other drugs, they were really harshly criminalized. But 1990s, it was not, I wouldn't say that the state was turning the blind eye, sort of like not completely looking at it, but it just didn't have capacities, I guess, in the 90s. It was the time, of big economic transformations and changes. And people were saying that even, for the police, it was actually a good way of earning money through bribing, through getting bribes. So for a period of time, it was... and that's why people could also legitimate about it. They would say, yes, we're not stealing from anyone. Look, even the police is coming and taking the bribes from us, So according to their kind of view, because police represents the state, obviously, the law. And then they would say, if the law even coming to us and taking bribes from us, then why do we need to stop? So for a period of time, yes, I think it was like that. But then from around 2010, the situation started changing and more kind of, harsher control was being implemented. And they really kind of, controlled the region much more. And it became much more difficult for people to engage in this activity as it was for almost 20 years throughout 1990s and before 2010s.
And for a country like Kyrgyzstan, which does not have an immense amount of natural resources like, Kazakhstan or even Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, wouldn't it actually make sense to legalize cannabis and to earn money on the harvesting and the selling of the drug or for medical purposes or cannabis for medical purposes?
Kyrgyzstan has a lot of resources. We have gold and other things, I guess. In terms of the legalization of cannabis, there were lots of different conversations, and even on the level of the state, there were some conversations which were happening or debates even in the parliament. So, every now and then, after a few years, there's some kind of, conversation saying it would be actually good to legalize cannabis production. And not only for, drug consumption kind of, purposes, but cannabis can be also, if it doesn't have this kind of, high level of potency, THC potency, then it can be also used for legal cultivation, for industrial purposes, for other kind of purposes. But I think the state is always very cautious. I had interviews with also some of the representatives of the drug agencies, and they were saying that if just one country in Central Asia legalizes, it obviously then will drive the interest throughout the whole region, from the whole region, then it would lead to more issues, then it becomes more difficult to control it. So I think the worry is that, especially from the drug control agency kind of perspective, is that then more trafficking will happen and maybe other drugs will obviously kind of, be also trafficked more, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the worry how to contain it if it's legalized, and it would drive the interest from the whole region into the country.
And what do we know about hashish or cannabis harvesting in other countries of Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan. We know, obviously, that Afghanistan is a huge source of cannabis or of hashish. But what about other neighbors of Kyrgyzstan? Is it also available there, or it's only Kyrgyzstan?
No, Kazakhstan also has a stretch called Chu region, Chu Valley. So there's also a wild growing cannabis in that region too. I haven't done my own research in that region, but I have heard that actually it is also illegally produced for the drug consumption purposes in there too. Tajikistan, no, I don't think cannabis has been cultivated that much according to what I have read and I know about it. So yeah, they're not really involved in cannabis production in that region. I think it's mainly the south of Kazakhstan and mainly north of Kyrgyzstan. Yeah.
And have you heard about cannabis harvesting in Uzbekistan, for example? Because it kind of might make sense that it's also harvested there, or it also grows there.
No, not much. Not much about Uzbekistan. In terms of cannabis harvesting, no, I haven't heard much about it.
Thank you, Gulzat. It was a great pleasure. I really learned a lot. And I must say that I'm a little bit jealous that you got to research this story and that you spent so much time researching those communities. I would love to do something like that. So thank you so much for this talk and all the best to you.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Thank you so much. I would just say that, if anyone is interested in this research, I have written the publications. I think I have like 3 or 4. They have been published already 2014, 2018, and 19. So they can find them very easily.
Okay, I will make sure to add the links or the titles of your publications to my newsletter.
Okay, that would be good. Thank you.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.